Hi everyone, how are you? It's Sue here, and we're going to talk this week about teams and teamworks first, and then I'm going to talk about professional roles and responsibilities a little bit later. I'll record that for you. But I am hoping that you're all staying warm. It's freezing around here. I'm not sure what it's like by you. And I'm hoping that you're starting to really get into the interprofessional course. Happy to hear from you if you're not connecting with the material, if you're not liking it, if you want me to do something differently, please let me know. My goal really is to make this as much as possible a meaningful learning experience for you. And I know you're all working very hard and you have a lot on your plate, so your time needs to be well spent. And just a thank you to all of you for your wonderful, collegial, lovely attitude towards learning that I see so far, and I just am so appreciative of it. So let's try to keep this short. I talk too much, so let's keep this one short and sweet, because I know you know some of the fundamentals of teams and teamwork, and let's talk a little bit more in detail. And I'm going to really stick for these two lectures to the text, so hopefully that will help you. Oh God, my computer always just seems to glitch out. Why? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I will attach the link in the PowerPoint that I put up for you, but I think this is hysterical. Has anybody seen the Lego movie? I think it maybe tells you about my mentality. There is this song in it that I love that goes, I can't sing because I have a very bad voice, but everything is awesome when you're part of a team. So it is hysterical when we talk about teams and teamwork, because really everything is awesome when you're part of a team, but it's got to be a team that works. Let's see if I can move this on. Okay, so what do we know about teamwork? And the chapter that you're going to read about teamwork today, starting chapter 3, really is actually rooted in chapter 1, where we even begin the very early in the textbook talking about teamwork. So teamwork is essentially goal-oriented. So we're not just hanging out, we're not just a bunch of friends having a good time, but there's a goal in what we're doing. So it's a goal at the center of our activities, and it's really rooted in relationships. Remember we talked about those dimensions last week? Teamwork is essentially a relationally based process. And it involves interactions and relationships for you guys between health professionals, a variety of health professionals in all kinds of settings who work together. And our goal is to address patient needs, the best possible outcomes for our patients. And we know that those best possible outcomes are tied to working effectively in teams. And the kinds of things that are necessary for that to happen involve coordination, cohesion, so that ability to pull together, to feel like you're a unit. Have you ever been part of a bunch of people working together, but you feel loose and straggly and like you're not really tight? Cohesion is that sort of bonding together, and it also requires that we take on leadership. And when we talk a little bit more later on about leadership requires also that we take on followership roles. So, for example, in your weekly postings, 5 times this term, a different member of your team is going to take on a leadership role, and the rest of you will take on followership roles. And followership is where you are supporting the leader of your team. So the objectives teamwork includes what we've talked about. It's goal-oriented and it has an objective. There's also responsibilities associated with working in a team. There's boundaries within a team. So you work in different kinds of settings and different kinds of relationships. And the boundaries are not the same in all kinds of teams that you may be part of. So there may be different cordial or friendship boundaries when you're on a soccer team, for example, or an extracurricular basketball team or something else, gaming team. But when you're on a healthcare team, those boundaries tend to be structured around your professional roles and responsibilities. I'm going to talk about that as well. And also there's a need to have real, full and complete sharing. Not always sharing about our personal lives, but sharing about how the team is functioning, what's necessary, the information that's necessary for the team to work together and to accomplish their goals. Team development is really a critical field of study. Now, we've been studying this for decades, literally since a big push from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And there's lots of different models that look at team development. And what I'm going to just draw your attention to, and there's in the text talks a little bit about other models, but I'm going to talk about a real classic, which is Tuckman's model. Now, Tuckman, many of you have heard of this model. that has all these stages. Tuckman's model was actually written or developed by 1965, so it's old, old, old. And the funny thing is, it's still as good today as it was back then. Lots of things are sort of nuanced, right? So we can always find little tidbits that are new and little different kinds of ideas. But this classic model of how people come together to form teams, work within teams, and then complete their work and break up or disband is so effective in really giving us some insight into how teams work, how throughout all those phases, and why we see sometimes the things that we're seeing. So let's start at the beginning, forming. And you notice these words all rhyme: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Adjourning, you have to fake it a little to make it rhyme. So in forming, that's the very first stage. And the group members begin to learn about each other, and they try to focus on what are the tasks at hand. So you might have done that in your team of 5. Now, many of you know each other. So you may already have moved past the forming stage, but because you were randomly assigned to teams, you may not have worked with some of the members that you have in your small teams. So forming is when you just begin to introduce yourself. And do you remember the week 1 activity was just introducing yourself to the people on your shift and really helping you to get to know each other. So it tends to be light and easy and just beginning to get to know each other and also try to get a sense of what your objectives are going to be. What are you going to have to accomplish? Now, the storming phase comes fairly quickly. And in this stage, group members often engage with each other in tension-filled kind of interactions. You may argue, you may struggle to have your perspective be the dominant perspective. And this is a natural, necessary process. So not to be alarmed that in the beginning, so you've just got to know each other, and quickly you move into this phase where there's sort of that struggle between members as they become comfortable with each other. And it's a period of tension, it's a period of conflict, and it's healthy. It's healthy for a team. You really have to let that out. Otherwise, if everyone stays silent and one person immediately becomes dominant, it's not a healthy team. In a healthy team, everyone sort of vies to be heard and has their own perspectives. You'll move from the storming phase into the norming phase. And this is a really, again, healthy, important phase where you begin to establish the norms within your group. So there's explicit rules, like the rules that we say we're going to show up on time, everybody's going to be polite to each other, things like that. And there's implicit rules, how we behave in certain ways. We're not going to have our phones out. We might make that an explicit rule. If somebody brought coffee last week, maybe I'll bring coffee this week. That kind of the implicit rules or the undefined rules, but that we start to fall into a pattern of behavior. And that helps us, again, to achieve our goal. And the kinds of communications that we'll take part in, that's also critical to the norming, because that, again, helps us to figure out how we meet the task that we've got facing us. Finally, performing. And in that stage, so we've done the forming, we got to know each other. We've done the storming. We really struggled to figure out who we are and how we're going to work together. We did the norming, where we come up with our standards, the expectations within our group of how we behave and how we do our work. And now we do the work, and that's the performing. We accomplish the task. We work together towards meeting that outcome. So for us in nursing environments, that would be accomplishing the work of nursing and creating the best possible conditions for our patients to feel cared for and to be cared for and to achieve the best possible outcomes in their health. And then finally, adjourning. It's important that we recognize that teams don't always continue to work together. For some of us, we may be part of long-term teams, for example, in a work environment, but you may be a part of a short-term team that's set up to solve a problem. For example, you're having med errors on your unit and there's a team created to look at why that's happening, or whatever an issue may be. And so at the end of that work of the short-term team, it's important that we really formally adjourn. We say, goodbye to our teammates. We formally acknowledge the ending of the work of the team. And we also really recognize what was effective and what wasn't. And that's for moving on for next time. Now, critical to this entire process is understanding communication and how communication is so fundamentally tied to the success of a team. And I bet all of you have experienced really crummy communication. Right? I know I have, and I know I've also been part of really crummy communication, and it's hard to recognize that and admit that, but it's true of all of us. But a really important point here is that communication predicts team success. Good communication is much more likely to have a successful team that's able to meet its goals. Poor communication, very unlikely that your team is going to be able to meet its goals. That's really important. And the structure by which we communicate is really important. And there's two little components of that. But coming back just a tiny bit, communication with the team is dependent on factors. So like the kind of team, right? The type of team, the type of objectives, and other things. But within that team and within that team structure, regardless of all the variable little components, there are two sort of elements that we want to consider. One is centrality. And centrality means, and just like the word, is there a central position, right? Is there a central position within the team, a core position, a core role within that team? And then efficiency. And that really refers to how well the structure of the team and the communication structure of the team supports you in communicating and information, in transmitting information between members. And these are really important components of what we call communication structures. And that's what I'm going to talk about just here briefly. So basic communication structures are essential mechanisms or routes by which we communicate. And so a really good example, I think that most people are familiar with, is that sort of top-down structure that, in the sort of a military type structure. That I'm going to not know the military term, so I apologize for anybody who may be in the military or know someone in the military and I'm flubbing this. But so let's say the general sets an order. That order is brought down to the next level person, brought down to the next level person, and finally brought down to the person, the private, the lowest level person in the military. So you move down the chain of command, right? And they call that the chain of command. Here we talk about several different communication structures. So in the line structure, you go again, and the next slide is going to make this a little bit clearer. From one person to another person to another person to another person. This is a singular line of communication. And I'll give you the example in a minute where we talk about from a manager down. And another type of communication is a why. So if you imagine you could have on your unit the nursing manager and the chief physician, or the nursing educator, let's say. And you've got communication from the nursing manager, communication from the nursing educator, and both of them communicate down to the charge nurse, and from the charge nurse, she communicates down in a line to the rest of the people. You also can have a circle communication where there's communication from all people around to each other, and there's quite effective communication, or star, and I'll show you that on the next page, where you have communication among many members happening across different topics. So here's an example. So chain communications, remember I talked about that sort of chain of command, we often refer to it, and this is a line where we see, let's say the nurse manager talks to the charge nurse, or the charge nurse could talk, respond back to her. The charge nurse then communicates that to staff nurses, or staff nurses could then communicate back to the charge nurse. And the staff nurses then communicate to service assistants. Let's say you might have a PSW, you might have unit clerk, or some kind of board aide or other role, and that person would communicate back to the staff nurses. So do you see, everybody's not talking to everybody. The nurse manager isn't talking to the staff nurses or the service assistant. The staff nurses are not talking to the nurse manager. So it's really critical that you see this sort of linear communication, top down or bottom up, but one person, sort of one role at a time. The challenge with this kind of communication is not very effective because you don't have an opportunity for all people to be heard in all situations. So if let's say the manager makes a decision, she communicates it to the charge nurse. If the charge nurse doesn't see an issue or a concern with that, then she passes it on to the staff nurses. But the staff nurses may say, wait a second, that's going to be a problem, because they're the ones doing that frontline care. And they recognize that the decision that manager made is going to really impact their frontline care. Now they have to go back to the charge nurse, and the charge nurse has to go back to the nursing manager, who was the one who made the decision. As opposed to having some other kind of communication where everybody could talk together. And here's an example that's quite the opposite extreme, where it's all channels. Everybody talks to everybody. So the nursing manager talks to all the people. The nurse practitioner talks to all the members. The staff nurses talk to all the members. The physician talks to all the members. So it's much more broad and open and cohesive communication. This is a much more modern model of communication, and it's much healthier, but it also raises the expectation or the responsibility of nurses to be able to communicate with all levels of administration. And sometimes you're dealing with issues of power, and that can be difficult when you're, sometimes you might like someone to be your advocate. So to be able to have the charge nurse go and talk to the physician about something as opposed to doing it directly yourself. So there are benefits to all the different methods or the communication structures. It's important that you create communication structures, though, that are going to serve the work of your team. It's also important that you create communication structures where every member can be heard in the way that is most essential for the work to be accomplished and for that member to feel valued, right, and to be able to fully contribute. So now let's talk about another important topic when we're looking at teams and teamworks, and that's what happens with norms and normative pressure. And this is a pretty common area of focus as well. So when we're working in teams, we're working in groups. Do you remember we talked about within one of the stages, forming, storming, norming? In that third stage, we really looked at how we create the norms within a group. That is an area of study all on its own, and it's a really important one. So when we talk about norms and normative pressures, we're really looking at what are the standards or what are the expectations of behavior. What are the attitudes and what are the perceptions within that team? What are the expectations for that at that team's, not only their behavior, but their own thoughts, or their own, not really their thoughts, their own attitudes and how they look at things. And I'll give you a really good example. When you think about the College of Nurses of Ontario, which is our regulatory body, and we are self-regulatory, but the standards and the expectations of behavior are set out, and within our team of registered nurses, registered practical nurses, and RNEC or nurse practitioners, there are standards and expectations of behavior and of attitudes that are consistently held and expected to be held. So the norms for us within nursing are set out within all of those standards. And there's lots of ways that norms can be communicated, both explicitly, as in those C&O standards, but also implicitly in different ways. So sometimes there's norms about, excuse me, behaviors. For example, let's say you work on a unit and the expectation is that everyone arrives early, not just at change of shift, but there is, everyone arrives, let's say, typically 15 minutes before the change of shift. So there is lots of time to give report and to have report as a face-to-face handover, or there could be other kinds of expectations. But I think recognizing that within each team, those norms can be very explicit or written down or communicated formally. They can also be quite implicit, and we can feel both pressure to comply to those norms, to participate in the team within those norms, whether those expectations are made explicit, so we're shown the rules, we know the rules, we learn about them, or we just feel them. We start to get a sense of what people expect of us. And it's really important that when we're talking about teams, not just in our own lives or with our friends or other kinds of groups, that that these norms and normative pressures really should focus on the activities related to our role. So for us, it's our activities related to being an RN, and not just norms about our personal life and things like that. They should be norms associated with our role. And they may be about things like how we interact with each other, how we are with our patients, how our relationships evolve with each other. So how formal we are with each other, or how friendly, informal we become with each other and with our patients. And the various responsibilities, various jobs that members of the team engage in, take part in. And then finally, important to recognize that there are very different norms associated with different professions. So the norms and normative pressures that nurses experience are very different from those that physicians experience or that the pharmacist may experience. So those are very profession specific, and the culture of the profession is very deeply embedded in that. But within interprofessional teams, norms and normative pressures are very important. And they serve really important functions. In particular, 3 areas that I want to talk about. So for task functions, norms and normative pressures allow teams to get organized and to coordinate their activities, and that really helps you to meet your goals. For maintenance functions, norms and normative pressures that are related to maintenance issues, so maintaining your team and those team processes that are essential for keeping your team functioning. Things like attending meetings or attending work or making decisions, who makes decisions and how are decisions made in terms of input and things like that. They really help to keep the teams intact, working together and progressing towards their goals. And then another interesting one is social reality functions. So norms and normative pressures provide social definitions or social interpretations of the reality so that all of us sort of live or experience situations in a way that is commonly defined. And so it's an interesting perspective that these norms or normative pressures help us to interpret a situation, help us to actually interpret what we're experiencing or what we're seeing. All right, so what do we know about the challenges or the barriers to team effectiveness? And that's a really important topic because as much as we want teams to succeed, there are many times when teams really struggle. And it's important to recognize what those things are that impede a team's ability to be successful. So the first is professional identity. And for many of us, we have experienced nursing in a way where we see these, what it's called silos of practice. And that meant that physicians were educated separately and they practiced separate from the nurses. Nurses were educated just with nurses. We practiced separately from the pharmacist and all the members of the team. So those professional silos, we all operate within our own orientation and our own professional identity. I don't see myself so much a member of the healthcare team as I see myself as a nurse. And that still persists, and it really impedes our ability to engage in collaborative interactions. And differences in attitudes are really critical. So often conflicts within a team can arise because we have differing and even negative attitudes towards teams and teamwork. So some of us may just say we hate working in teams, or it's been hard to find teams where I really feel that I'm able to make a good contribution. And so there's a term that's called in-grouping. And in in-grouping, what happens is that some professionals might really have actually negative attitudes about another professional group, and then that can really lead to a persistent bad idea. So for example, you often see this in the conflict between physicians and nurses. So we often see the doctor bashing or the nurse bashing one way or the other between those two. So that in-grouping is that you sort of associate yourself within your group and you have a negative perception towards that other group. And so these attitudes can really lead to a poor climate where teamwork is really impeded. Blurring of roles is another really important area. So when we have a lack of clarity about one another's roles in the team, that can really be a barrier to teamwork. And it can lead to things like confusion, tension, and even rivalry as you think, I can do that better than someone else can do that, but another member of the team can do that. And so role ambiguity can also lead to negative patient outcomes and negative healthcare team member outcomes. It can get us into trouble because lines of accountability are really unclear if there's role ambiguity. We're not sure exactly what our roles and responsibilities are. So it's important that we know not only our own role, but the other member of the team's role and behave according to those roles. Preconceptions and assumptions are also really important. So teams in healthcare environments also often have assumptions that members have the capacity to engage in team-based practice, but not everybody can or wants to engage in team practice at the outset. All of us have to learn to do this effectively together. And so that expectation that people can just jump into a team environment and fit in, as opposed to recognizing that you need to go through those team processes of coming together and beginning to work together in order to be effective within that team is really important. Lack of clarity is really an issue in terms of team effectiveness, and often we see that around things like goals. What is the goal of the team? What are the policies that we work under, official policies, and within our own team, how do we interpret those? And also outcomes. What are we looking for in terms of our outcomes? And that confusion that's caused by the lack of clarity here can result in ambiguity, and members can start to behave in manners that are counterproductive. So we just don't achieve our outcomes. And a lack of clear patient and team goals can lead to bad care and poor patient outcomes again. So our challenge is working collaboratively together in effective teams to promote patient outcome, and having real clarity about our own role, about the roles of others, about the goals that we are trying to achieve, and the policies, and what the possible outcomes may be is really critical to that process. Having different approaches and different procedures under which we operate is also one of the barriers to team effectiveness. So when we think about teams of professionals where they're not working from the same base, they're not working from the same bottom line, it's really hard sometimes to come together and achieve a common goal when you feel like there's very little common ground. And then sometimes it's just the system. It's not the people, it's the system. So there's regulatory issues, or there's legislative frameworks that really contribute to that idea of practicing in silos, right? So who is responsible, who carries all the legal accountability and things like that, can make it really challenging to work effectively in a team where we share our ideas and perspectives, but then often one member of the team may feel that we all have different ideas, but the buck stops here and I'm the one who will be sued if we don't have a good patient outcome. So challenging some of those systems barriers is really important if we're going to move on to really effective, deeply effective teamwork. Okay, so how do we facilitate team effectiveness? How do we make our teams work really effectively? And there's 3 levels we want to talk at. One is the practice level. So what do we do in a practice setting? The next level is an organizational level. What do we do within our whole organization? And the third is within the system. How do we make it better when we're looking at the healthcare system in general? So it's really important when we look at the practice level that high levels of contact and interaction among team members, so frequent team meetings, making sure we all document in the same system, for example, that when we used to have a nursing documentation and the physicians would document on their sheets in a different part, now we've gone to electronic documentation, and much more likely that we have that common documentation system. So everyone is documenting in the same place, they're reading each other's notes, they're paying attention to it in a very different way. Regular patterns of communication are so important. Also having shared values in a supportive environment, which is both encouraging and positive and creates a really positive climate, is essential to promoting effectiveness. Having effective interpersonal and group processes are essential. So making sure that there's respect for other professionals, that we move through processes where we determine role clarity, we understand our own role and the role of others within the team. We're effective at conflict resolution. We're not conflict averse, so not afraid of conflict, and we'll talk about that later in the term, but we are effective at resolving conflict, right? Moving beyond conflict. And we also have that idea of shared accountability and responsibility. And again, we talked a little bit earlier about communication patterns, having effective communication patterns. In the end, it's also important to have leadership, good, strong leadership. And for many of us, that means that we will rotate in and out of various leadership roles over the course of a shift, where I'm a leader in the moment at the bedside, leader at the bedside, where I may take on a rotating role, for example, a charge nurse, or where I may become a more formal leader in terms of a nurse manager. When we think of the organizational level, it's really important that we look at the culture and the commitment to interprofessional practice and to teams and teamwork. It's really important that the organizations that you work in support the development of healthy teams, and that means that they have to put some effort into that happening. And so one of the ways that they can do that is to adopt policies that promote and support interprofessional practice and the integration of those core interprofessional practice competencies. Remember, we've talked about that. And also having structures in place and the resources that can support teamwork. Finally, at the systems level, and this one sometimes seems abstract and it seems like it's too broad to even consider, but it's important that our legislative and regulatory structures support teamwork. And when we think of the practice environment, it's so important that we recognize that various members of the team feel incredible pressure sometimes around those legislative and regulatory issues. For us as nurses, we know we always work within our competencies, right? Within our designated competencies. So one of the really key issues that we've identified, and we're going to have a whole class on that, is looking at liability issues and regulatory issues as we look at interprofessional practice. Finally, IPE, interprofessional education. So changes to education and accreditation processes are really essential, and having much more of that work that we've talked about, where you're in class with each other. Our BSCN students, PT students, OT students, pharmacy students, paramedic students, all kinds of different health professionals in class together, learning not just about each other, me telling you about pharmacy or medicine, but you're actually learning the same thing, because we have much overlap in our programs, learning the same thing, and you're learning with each other and about each other at the same time. So critical as we move into interprofessional education. And we're also going to talk more about that in its own separate lecture. So this was a quick and dirty overview of teams and teamworks. It really followed the chapter, so I hope you'll find that interesting and helpful. And I'm going to post both the link to this lecture and the slides as well. Have a great evening or great day if this is the morning, and I will see you soon on Zoom.